My name is Claire Whitman, and the night my father gave everything away was the night I finally understood my place in this family. The ballroom at the Grand Lakes Hotel in Chicago was glowing under crystal chandeliers. 200 guests in black ties stood with champagne in hand, celebrating my parents' 40th anniversary. It looked perfect. It always did. My father, Richard Whitman, stepped onto the stage with a smile that had convinced people for decades that he was a man worth trusting. He raised his glass and said, "Tonight, we celebrate legacy. And it's time to pass that legacy forward." The room quieted instantly. Then he turned toward my younger sister. "To the daughter who represents the future of this family, we are officially transferring ownership of the lakeside house to Sophie." Applause filled the room. Warm, loud, unquestioning. Sophie laughed, wrapping her arm around her fiancé, Daniel, her face glowing under the lights. She looked exactly like the life my parents had always wanted to display. Effortless. Admired. Untouched by reality. I stood there, holding my glass, watching it all unfold. I didn't react. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. Because I knew something no one else in that room knew. That house wasn't a gift. It was a liability. A carefully wrapped burden disguised as love. And as the applause echoed around me, I realized something even more important. This wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the one paying for it. If you had asked anyone in that room who kept the Whitman family standing, they would have pointed to my father. If you had asked who made everything look effortless, they would have said my mother. And if you had asked who represented the future, they would have smiled and said Sophie. No one would have said my name. Because my role was never meant to be seen. I was the one behind the scenes. The one who made sure the lights stayed on, the events happened on time, and the illusion never cracked. Not because I was asked to. Because I believed that was what loyalty looked like. 3 years ago, when my parents missed 3 mortgage payments on the lakeside house, I wired the money quietly. No announcement. No thank you. Last year, when their credit cards started getting declined during a charity dinner, I stepped outside, called the caterer, and covered the bill before anyone noticed. And tonight, the very event they were celebrating, this entire anniversary gala, the venue, the lighting, the music, even the champagne in everyone's hands, was paid for from my account. My mother had told me, "We're just tight on cash flow this month." I didn't question it. I never did. Sophie's dress, the one everyone kept complimenting, cost over $6,000. I paid for that too. Because my mother said it was important that Sophie looked perfect. That word always came up. Perfect. Perfect image. Perfect family. Perfect daughter. But perfection is expensive. And someone always has to cover the cost. For years, I told myself it was normal. That I was the responsible one. The reliable one. The strong one. But standing there in that ballroom, watching my father hand over a house I had helped keep afloat, something inside me finally shifted. I wasn't the strong one. I was the safety net. And the truth is, people don't appreciate the safety net. They only notice it when it's gone. There is a moment, when you have been carrying something for too long, where the weight does not suddenly get heavier. It simply becomes impossible to ignore. For years, I told myself a story. That I was helping my family stay afloat. That without me, everything would fall apart. That my sacrifices meant something. That one day, they would see me, not as the one who fixed everything, but as someone who mattered. But standing there, listening to the applause meant for a gift I had unknowingly helped finance, that story finally broke. Not with anger. Not with pain. With clarity. I looked around the room. At the polished smiles. At the effortless conversations. At the people who believed they were witnessing a successful family passing down a legacy. And for the first time, I saw it for what it really was. A performance. And I wasn't part of the cast. I was part of the production. I was the one making sure the lights stayed on so everyone else could shine. There is a dangerous kind of hope that keeps people like me in place. The belief that if you just solve one more problem, if you just give a little more, if you just hold everything together a little longer, eventually, things will change. Eventually, you will be appreciated. Eventually, you will be loved. But that kind of hope is not strength. It is a chain. And the worst part is, it is a chain you build yourself. Because it feels safer to believe that your value comes from what you provide, rather than risk discovering that it never did. As I stood there, holding my untouched drink, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't keeping them stable. I was making it possible for them to keep using me. And the moment I saw that clearly, something inside me let go. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But completely. And once that happened, there was no going back. Once you see the truth clearly, the next step is not anger. It is decision. I didn't confront my parents that night. I didn't walk up to the stage or interrupt the speech. I didn't create a scene. Because scenes can be dismissed. Facts cannot. Instead, I placed my glass on a passing tray and quietly stepped away from the crowd. No one noticed. They never did. The music was still playing, soft and elegant, blending into the hum of polite conversation. Guests were laughing, servers were moving smoothly between tables, and Sophie was still at the center of it all, glowing under the attention. Everything was exactly as it should be. On the surface. I made my way toward the back of the ballroom, where the audiovisual booth was set up. A young technician stood behind the control panel, adjusting levels, watching the stage with half his attention. When he saw me, he straightened slightly. We had already spoken earlier that evening. I had told him there would be a change in the program. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded, like someone who understood that some moments are better handled without curiosity. Behind him, the large projection screen was ready. A paused image sat frozen in place. A smiling family photo. My parents on their wedding day, standing side by side, full of promise. It was meant to be the beginning of a carefully edited slideshow. 40 years of curated memories. Vacations. Birthdays. Milestones. A perfect story. That was what everyone was expecting. Something sentimental. Something safe. Something that would reinforce everything they already believed. I opened my laptop and placed it gently on the table. But the file on my screen wasn't a montage. It was a record. Every transfer. Every missed payment. Every quiet rescue no one ever acknowledged. All organized. All undeniable. I looked once more toward the stage. My father was laughing with a group of guests. My mother was adjusting her necklace, smiling like nothing had ever gone wrong. Sophie leaned into Daniel, holding the deed like it meant security. That was the moment I understood. They weren't pretending. They actually believed their own version of the story. I connected the cable. Took a breath. And said quietly to the technician, "We're ready." Because the difference between an illusion and the truth is simple. One depends on silence. The other only needs to be seen. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started with something small. The music stopped. Not dramatically, not with a sudden cut that demanded attention, but with a quiet interruption, like a note that simply didn't resolve. Conversations softened. A few heads turned toward the stage. Then the screen flickered. At first, no one thought much of it. They expected the slideshow to begin. A few guests even leaned forward slightly, ready for the familiar sequence of smiling photos and sentimental music. But what appeared on the screen wasn't a memory. It was a document. Black and white. Plain. Unmistakable. At the top, in bold letters, were two words that didn't belong in a room like this. Notice of default. The reaction was subtle, but immediate. People didn't gasp. They didn't speak. They simply stopped moving. The kind of stillness that happens when something doesn't fit, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. I stepped out from the shadows near the back and walked toward the stage. Each step was steady. Measured. Unhurried. I reached for the microphone and felt its weight settle into my hand. Cold. Solid. Real. For a brief moment, I looked out at the room. 200 people, all dressed for a celebration, now staring at something they didn't understand. And then I spoke. Good evening. If I could have your attention for just a moment. My voice was calm. Even. The same tone I used in professional settings when facts mattered more than feelings. There's been a slight adjustment to tonight's program. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared. People were still trying to make sense of what they were seeing. I didn't rush. My father spoke about legacy. About image. About what gets passed down. I paused, just long enough for the words to settle. But before we continue, I think it's important to understand the cost behind that image. The room didn't react. But the silence changed. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was attention. And that was all I needed. Because once people start paying attention, the truth doesn't have to fight to be heard. It only has to be shown. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The image you've all seen tonight, I continued, is carefully constructed. And like most things that look perfect, it comes with a cost. I clicked the remote. The screen changed. A photograph appeared. Bright, warm, almost cinematic. My parents and Sophie standing on a beach in Malibu, laughing under a painted sunset, drinks in hand, not a single worry in sight. A few people in the room smiled instinctively. It was the kind of image they were used to seeing. The kind that confirmed everything they believed about us. This was taken 2 summers ago, I said. A family vacation. Beautiful, right? A few nods. Quiet agreement. Then I clicked again. The image shifted into a split screen. On the left, the same perfect photo. On the right, a bank statement. Simple. Clear. Undeniable. Total cost of this trip, I said calmly, $14,000. I let that sit for a second. Source of funds. 3 missed mortgage payments on the lakeside property. The smiles disappeared. No one spoke. I didn't pause for long. Click. Another image filled the screen. Sophie, standing next to a white convertible with a ribbon across the hood. Her birthday. Her smile wide. Confident, untouched by anything complicated. A gift, I said. Or at least, that's how it was presented. Click. Split screen again. The car wasn't purchased. It was leased. Using a high-interest line of credit taken against the house you all just watched being gifted tonight. I kept my tone steady. No principal payments have been made in 4 years. Only interest. The room had gone completely still now. No shifting. No whispers. Just attention. Click. A third image. A charity gala from last year. My parents dressed elegantly, standing beside donors, smiling like everything was under control. This event, I said, was praised for its generosity. Click. The numbers replaced the image. The payment for this event was declined twice before it was covered. I didn't say by who. I didn't have to. Because by now, the pattern was clear. I looked out at the room. At some point, we stop asking whether something looks good, I said quietly. And we start asking what it actually costs. No one moved. Because the illusion hadn't just cracked. It had been replaced. And once you see the difference between appearance and reality, you can't unsee it. No matter how much you might want to. I let the silence hold for a moment longer. Then I clicked again. The images disappeared. The screen returned to a single document. Clean. Formal. Cold. The deed to the lakeside house. This, I said, is what was just presented as a legacy. I didn't look at the crowd this time. I looked directly at Sophie. She was still holding the physical copy in her hands, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges. It looks like ownership, I continued. It feels like security. I paused. But that depends on what comes with it. I clicked the remote. Numbers appeared beside the document. Loan balances. Interest rates. Payment deadlines. All aligned. All clear. The property currently carries multiple outstanding loans, I said calmly. Totaling over $250,000. A ripple moved through the room. Not loud but undeniable. The mortgage is behind. The penalties are accumulating. And there is a balloon payment due in 60 days. I let that settle. Then I said the part that mattered most. This transfer doesn't remove the debt. Another pause. It moves it. Sophie blinked, her expression shifting, not dramatically, but enough for anyone paying attention to see the change. Confusion. Then doubt. I kept my voice steady. When ownership changes, so does responsibility. New name. New liability. New obligation to resolve what's already been set in motion. I didn't use complicated language. I didn't need to. Because the truth, when it's simple, lands harder. They didn't give you a house, I said gently. They gave you everything attached to it. For the first time, Sophie looked away from me and down at the document in her hands. Not like someone receiving a gift. But like someone trying to understand what they had just been handed. Across the room, my mother shifted in her seat. My father straightened his posture. And just like that, the balance of the room changed. Because this was no longer about perception. It was about consequence. And consequences are much harder to celebrate. By now, the room understood something was wrong. But they still didn't understand how deep it went. I clicked the remote again. The deed disappeared. A new title appeared on the screen. Wedding Fund. I let the words sit there for a moment. Then I spoke. About a year and a half ago, a fund was set up to cover the wedding expenses. I turned slightly, looking toward Daniel. You contributed $50,000 to that account. He didn't speak. But his expression changed. Focused. Alert. I clicked again. A bank statement appeared. Clear. Direct. Incoming transfer. $50,000. Dated and confirmed. This was the deposit, I said. For the venue. The planning. The event everyone has been looking forward to. Another click. The next line appeared. Outgoing transfer. Same amount. Next day. I didn't rush the explanation. The funds were not used for the wedding. I let that settle. Then I continued. They were redirected. No accusations. Just facts. Another document appeared. Registration details. Ownership structure. Simple enough for anyone to follow. The destination account is tied to a private entity. I paused briefly. An entity. Controlled by my father. The silence shifted again. This time, heavier. Not confusion. Understanding. I kept my tone steady. The venue deposit was never paid from that account. A small pause. It was covered later. Separately. I didn't explain further. I didn't say that it was me. I didn't need to. Because the pattern was already clear. I looked back at Daniel. This isn't about a mistake, I said carefully. It's about how the money was handled. He stood still for a moment. Then asked, quietly, where did it go? A fair question. One that deserved a clear answer. I met his gaze. It didn't go toward the wedding. A brief pause. It went somewhere else entirely. No dramatics. No raised voices. Just the kind of truth that doesn't need emphasis to land. And in that moment, something in the room shifted again. Because this was no longer about image. It was about trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't come back quietly. The room didn't erupt. It tightened. Conversations stopped completely. Glasses remained untouched. No one wanted to be the first to move, as if any sound might confirm what they were all beginning to understand. I lowered the remote slightly and stepped back from the center of the stage. For the first time that night, I wasn't speaking. I didn't need to anymore. All eyes shifted to my father. Richard Whitman stood there, his posture rigid, his expression carefully controlled. But the confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. My mother leaned toward him, whispering something urgent, her composure slipping in small, visible ways. Then Sophie spoke. Softly at first. Is that true? Her voice wasn't angry. It was uncertain. That made it heavier. My father didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his cuff, glanced at the guests, then back at Sophie. It's more complicated than that, he said. A familiar line. One I had heard too many times. Sophie shook her head slightly, her grip tightening on the document. No, she said, a little louder now. It's not complicated. It's simple. She looked down at the numbers again, then back up. You gave me something that isn't paid for. The words landed harder than anything I had said. Across the room, Daniel took a step back. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just enough to create distance. And that distance said everything. I need clarity, he said evenly. Not accusing. Not emotional. Just firm. And that was the moment everything shifted completely. Because this was no longer about defending an image. It was about answering a question. One that didn't have a comfortable answer. My father opened his mouth to respond. But for once, there was nothing he could say that would make this look different. The structure he had built over years didn't collapse loudly. It gave way quietly. Under the weight of its own truth. I didn't stay to hear the rest. I had already heard enough. The questions. The silence. The shift in how people looked at my parents. None of it needed my presence anymore. The truth had done its job. I placed the microphone back on the stand with the same steady movement I had picked it up with. No dramatic gesture. No final statement. Just closure. For a brief moment, I looked toward Sophie. She was still standing in the center of the room, the document lowered in her hands, her expression no longer confident, no longer certain. Just aware. She glanced in my direction. Not with resentment. Not with anger. But with something quieter. Recognition. I gave a small nod. Nothing more. Because this was never about hurting her. It was about ending something that had gone on for too long. Then I turned and walked away. Through the same room I had helped create. Past the same people who had admired a version of our family that no longer existed. No one stopped me. No one called my name. And for the first time, that didn't feel like rejection. It felt like freedom. When I stepped outside, the night air was cool and still. The noise from inside faded as the doors closed behind me. And standing there, alone, I realized something simple. I didn't win anything tonight. I didn't gain anything new. I just stopped carrying what was never mine to begin with. And that was enough. 3 months passed. Not dramatically. Not with headlines or public statements. Just quietly, the way most real consequences unfold. I didn't follow every detail. I didn't need to. Information has a way of finding its way back to you when you've been part of something long enough. My parents were no longer hosting events. No more polished dinners. No more carefully curated appearances. The lakeside house had been taken over by the bank. Empty now. Stripped of everything that once made it look impressive. My father tried to maintain control at first. Tried to explain things away. But explanations don't carry much weight when the numbers are already clear. My mother stopped reaching out. Not out of respect. But because there was nothing left to ask for. Sophie's life changed the most. She moved out of the apartment she shared with Daniel. Found a smaller place across the city. Started working full-time at a retail store. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't curated. But it was real. The last time I saw her, she was walking down the street with a coffee in her hand, dressed simply, no attention, no performance. She looked different. Not broken. Just grounded. And me? I moved into a quiet apartment of my own. No events. No expectations. No emergency calls to fix something that was never my responsibility. Just space. The kind of space that doesn't demand anything from you. And in that space, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride. Not relief. Something steadier than that. Peace. There is something people don't talk about enough. The cost of being the one who holds everything together. If you are the reliable one, the fixer, the person everyone turns to when things fall apart, it can start to feel like that is your purpose. Like your value comes from how much you can carry. And for a while, it works. You keep things stable. You solve problems. You protect the people around you from consequences they don't want to face. But over time, something changes. The help you give stops being appreciated. And starts being expected. Then eventually, it becomes invisible. That's the part that's hardest to accept. Not that people need you. But that they stop seeing you. If any part of this story feels familiar, I want you to think about one simple question. If you stopped fixing everything tomorrow, what would actually happen? Would things fall apart? Or would people finally have to take responsibility for their own choices? Because sometimes, the most important boundary you can set isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the moment you decide that your role is no longer to absorb the impact of everyone else's decisions. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to choose stability for yourself. And you are allowed to build a life that doesn't depend on being needed to function. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've ever been in a position like this, I'd really like to know. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now?